Why is Duncan Robinson completely out of the rotation? Recent comments from ESPN's Tim Legler suggest the Heat may have mismanaged their best shooter and have only made things worse. Is Legler right? And if so, can the Heat fix their $19 million problem? Plus, Jimmy Butler saved the day with a big fourth quarter in Detroit, but a comparison to Dwyane Wade after the game didn't seem to sit right with a current Heat star. We break it all down in today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome to Locked On Heat, your daily podcast on the Miami Heat. I'm Wes Goldberg here with David Ramil. However, you might be tuning in on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app, thanks so much for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. So the Heat have adjusted their lineups to try and reinvigorate the offense. They've got Max Strus starting in place of Kevin Love. Love is the backup center. Victor Oladipo out of the rotation. Yet, even though this team is trying to find a way to juice the offense, their best three-point shooter, Duncan Robinson, still can't get minutes. He's played just 80 minutes this calendar year. This is something that's confused Tim Legler on JJ Redick's podcast. The clip has gone viral, David. I know you've seen it. I want to play that sound for the audience and then get your reaction after that. So here's the sound.
It's been mind-boggling to me this entire time for the last couple of years here. What in the world happened to Duncan Robinson? In terms of the way they view him, okay? Because the guy was like, record-setting for the franchise with his three-point shooting, prolific, had big moments in the postseason, and he's been healthy. He's played 80 minutes this calendar year since January 1st. He's played 80 minutes, and they gave him, I think, $18 million a year after, he had those 2 or 3 years in a row in Miami where he made 200-plus threes, and they gave him $18 million a year as like what? As like an appreciation for what you've done for us, and now you go have a seat. And this is the worst three-point shooting team, one of the worst three-point shooting teams in the league. You've got Duncan Robinson over there. You paid him all that money, but they have like no faith in him. And now he's got no rhythm. So when he does play, it's not happening for him.
How much blame do you think the Heat should get for the management of Duncan Robinson? And first of all, I guess before you even answer that, David, like the idea of the fact that he just can't get into a rhythm because he's basically been out of the rotation the entire time. Do you buy that?
Yes, I absolutely do. We've seen it from him. I won't say that Duncan is necessarily not used to being in this position because we know his journey. We know what he had to get through just to be able to get to this point. And earlier in his career, he wasn't getting a lot of minutes, but we didn't see this kind of production from him. If you recall his rookie season, or the first season he spent with the Heat, right? And where he was basically barely playing in Dwyane's last season. He didn't really get much of an opportunity. He didn't shoot particularly well. And I think a lot of that has to do with being a rhythm shooter, which I think Duncan absolutely is. And then he starts the next season, puts in the work over the offseason, and he fits in more complementarily, I think, to Jimmy Butler and the fact that Butler can't shoot. And it was that first season, 1920, with Myers Leonard starting, Tyler coming off the bench still as a rookie, excuse me. So you test Duncan, and he earns the respect of his teammates and the coaching staff. And then now, all of a sudden, to Legler's point, he's fallen out of the rotation. I think absolutely he has lost the rhythm. I don't know if the confidence necessarily is the biggest problem because
he's never been the same since the shooting slump to open last season. After he signs the contract, questions from all around. Did the Heat blow this contract? Is he overpaid because of that shooting slump to open the season? He loses his starting job eventually to Max Strus. He's actually out of the rotation altogether. This is a guy who's talked openly about the imposter syndrome, right?
Yes.
And I know that he regrets even making those comments publicly and making that a storyline. But if that's even a little bit there, and JJ Redick goes on in this podcast to say confidence to a shooter is more important than almost anything. And if you are sapped,
well, he also to his point, he also to that point, he also supported Duncan and saying that a lot of people in the NBA, and he's right about this, get paid, don't put in the work, and don't do what's necessary to justify that contract. But knowing Duncan the way he does, remember, Duncan got his podcast start through JJ Redick. he knows that Duncan has put in the work. He knows that he's not that type of guy who just takes the money and run. And that's not what Duncan's done.
I don't think that anybody who knows what's going on thinks that that's what is happening. I'm sure there's fans that are upset with the fact that he's making it. And that's fine. If you're upset with the fact that he's making a ton of money on the cap and not playing, I get that. You could direct that anger to the front office. You could direct it to Duncan. I don't really care. The thing is that he lost the confidence. And I think
I don't think he's lost the confidence, though. I don't think he has
whatever
lost
it is. He lost the confidence. He has the confidence. He's not in a rhythm. And I think there is a level of mismanagement from the Heat. If
no
the
doubt,
coaching staff and the front office deserves any criticism over the last 2 years, you could start with how the Duncan Robinson situation has played out. And I actually thought this was an interesting point. JJ Redick brought it up. Both Tim and JJ later on in the show. We didn't play the sound of it, but said if they just said early in the season, hey, no matter what, 8 games, we're going to play Duncan Robinson 25 minutes in 8 straight games, and we're just going to let him shoot 10 plus times in those games. And we're just going to let him find a rhythm. And you could just, whatever happens, the fouling, whatever, you just play through it in 8 games in, let's just call it December. And I actually thought that was a really good idea. And I think this coaching staff has failed Duncan Robinson and in turn failed their team because, as they pointed out, this is one of the worst 3-point shooting teams in the NBA. And having a guy like Duncan Robinson not be able to help is a complete waste. And it's almost dumbfounding. I can't think of anything else like it where
I've
have
heard
one of the better 3-point shooters
rumblings
in the league and on your bench, and you're one of the worst 3-point shooting teams in the NBA, and yet like, you would think it's easy enough to draw that line connecting the two, and it's an easy enough troubleshoot, and yet it's just not an option for them.
We've heard rumblings that perhaps Jimmy's lost faith in Duncan Robinson or doesn't necessarily believe in him as a teammate. Although publicly he's been supportive of Duncan, says, yeah, we can still count on Duncan as shooting. And I think he was pretty supportive last season as Duncan was working through whatever struggles he has. I think there have been some rumblings about that lack of faith behind the scenes. And look, he lost his starting job late last March. It was a particularly bad loss against the Brooklyn Nets. He was in foul trouble early on. He only wound up playing 13 minutes in that game. And it was in the midst of that 4-game losing streak where he had the issues with Eric Spoelstra and that loss against the Golden State Warriors at home. There was another home game. It was in the midst of a 4-game homestand. They had lost 3 home games in a row. They had lost 4 games in total. Duncan gets taken out of the starting lineup. They host the Sacramento Kings, who were still kind of incorporating Domantas Sabonis at that point, and they weren't nearly as good as they are now. They wound up beating that team by a wide margin, and I guess Spoelstra felt a little bit more comfortable just saying, well, Max is the guy. And
well, they like Max because he slides his feet better defensively. He doesn't foul as much. He's a little bit more physical. He can put the ball on the ground a little bit better than Duncan Robinson can. Like I don't think that the difference between Max Strus and Duncan Robinson is such that Max Strus is now starting and Duncan Robinson can't get minutes. I don't think the gap between those two players is that much where Max Strus is a deserving starter and Duncan Robinson is deserving of DNP CDs. That's especially the thing that I can't figure out.
$19 million devoted towards Duncan Robinson.
Well, and I know that's kind of where I want
to.
No, that matters. That matters. If you have that percentage of your salary cap in a salary cap league sitting on your bench and not being used, that matters. And so I bring up all this and I kind of want to spin it forward a little bit here, but when you look forward to next season, we've already talked about the impending free agencies of Max Strus, Gabe Vincent, Omer Yurtseven, and all these other guys. If all of them walk in free agency and Duncan Robinson is still here because you're not willing to attach whatever draft picks it takes to get rid of him and all these things, and he's still on this roster, is this too far gone? Can you even fix this issue at this point? Is it so bad now that the only thing that Duncan Robinson needs is a change of scenery? Or if all these guys are gone and you elevate Duncan Robinson back into the rotation because you have no other choice because all of your other 3-point shooters have walked away in free agency, then I don't know. Is there a world in which the Miami Heat and Duncan Robinson can coexist and work together, and Duncan Robinson can rediscover the shot that has basically left him for 2 seasons?
Do you want to answer that in the next segment?
Sure.
All right. Let's take a break here. Today's episode brought to you by iBought, a grocery, school shopping, and getting a little something for yourself. Well, you're already doing it. So why not get cash back for doing it with Ibotta? You can earn cash back on every shopping trip because Ibotta gives you cash back on hundreds of grocery items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods. You either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt after you shop, and you get your cash back. It's that easy. My wife's been using it for years. I didn't know what she was doing, but she kept telling me, oh, you know what? I'm getting money back for it. I'm like, hey, who doesn't want that? And that's why you've got to try Ibotta right now. Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKED. That's LOCKED when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app and use the code LOCKED. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store. And don't forget to use the code LOCKED.
Locked On Heat is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please do subscribe. Let's go back to the Duncan Robinson conversation before we get to Jimmy Butler, perhaps bristling at being compared to Dwyane Wade. So Strus, Gabe, those guys are going to be free agents. Omer Yurtseven could be a free agent. If all those guys walk out the door, the Heat are going to be left with looking for three-point shooting. I don't know that they're going to be able to find that on the minimum. I don't know that they're going to be able to find that via trade. We already know that in order to get rid of Duncan Robinson or even to trade Kyle Lowry, it's going to take some sort of draft capital. So I don't know that any of that stuff is necessarily going to happen. There is a world, David, where the Heat come back next year and Duncan Robinson is still on the roster. And I know that's a world that a lot of Heat fans probably don't think is possible or don't want to consider being possible, but it is. It's very much possible. It's a very realistic option here. And I just wonder,
even
you know what, based on the stuff that we've heard around the trade deadline, the fact that the Heat couldn't trade him then, it probably is more likely than not that Duncan Robinson is on the team next year. And so considering that, like, is there a path forward for Duncan Robinson and the Miami Heat?
Yeah, you just got to give him the opportunity. I don't think there's anything that's going to change who Duncan is as a player. He's going to still occasionally get called for the fouls. I don't think he could do anything to improve himself physically. He can't put in more work than he already does to get significantly better. And I know somebody's already saying, well, you know what? And Michael Jordan came back every year and always added something to his game. That's hyperbolic, first of all, more apocryphal than anything else. I think it's also a lot of the mythologizing of Michael Jordan.
He was also a top 1% athlete, and Duncan Robinson is not.
And then there's that. The baseline of athleticism is far superior than anything Duncan Robinson could ever hope to possess. And so, like, he's not going to turn around and have like a spin in the lane, kind of 180, fading away jump shot or dunk or anything like that.
And by the way, you don't want that. I don't want, like, people are like, Duncan Robinson doesn't have a mid-range game. I don't want him to have a mid-range game. I want him to have a three-point shot.
Well,
that's his job.
I don't know about that. I mean, look,
no, I know about it. I don't want that. That mid-range.
I know
shot
Eric Spoelstra has always said, Duncan, you're here to shoot. Yep. That's great until defenses start collapsing on him and taking him away out of the action, and he gets trapped in the corner. He can't do anything with it.
Then you pass
at that point,
and that creates space, and I have no problem with it.
But earlier in the season, like, he was working on a floater consistently. You saw him do it during practice. You saw him do it.
I have no problem. I have no problem with him getting to the basket. That's an efficient shot. It should be at the basket or threes. I
don't want him shooting a mid-range shot. That's for sure.
That's what I said. He doesn't need to develop some sort of Jimmy Butler turnaround jumper. Like, that's not his game. We don't want that from Duncan Robinson. The point, I'm with you. I do think that there's a path forward. It could just be out of necessity, right? At the end of the day, if the Heat are just not able to trade Duncan Robinson, and Duncan Robinson, in order to play, has to play for the Miami Heat. And I'm, by the way, not saying or reporting that there's any kind of friction between Duncan Robinson and the Miami Heat, but I don't think it takes a stretch of an imagination to say that Duncan Robinson is unhappy with not playing, and that the Heat are probably regretting signing him to that contract, given that he's not even in the rotation. But I do think that there's a way to push forward. What I find interesting about all of this, and I'll go back to it, is the fact that the Miami has basically thrown up their hands and said, well, we're not going to be great on defense and on offense. We kind of have to pick one. And surprisingly enough, they picked offense, and Duncan Robinson still can't get in the rotation. It does tell you a little bit how far gone he is on this current roster, but that does not mean that that's going to be the case on next year's roster either, especially if all those guys walk and you're looking around and you're like, well, we need somebody to space the floor. And there's Duncan Robinson sitting on the bench. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we look at this and say that was a weird 2-year blip. Duncan Robinson put in a little bit more work. Maybe he got better at not fouling and stuff defensively. I don't know. But there is a world.
I don't see why those things mattered from one day to the next. Because this was who he was during that season where he was setting records for the Miami Heat. And this is more towards Legler's point, but it's one that I've said on the show before. Why did they lose faith in Duncan Robinson, who's no worse or no better?
Because he wasn't shooting at a 40% clip anymore.
That's fair. That's fair.
That's
but I think one, there was the pressure of the contract, and he said it. He's copped to it, and I think he's right in doing so. Second to that, I think there was pressure there, and he had a bad stretch. But we've also you're not going to help him. And maybe
that's
they
the
just
mismanagement that we're getting to, and what
no
Tim
doubt. I think
and
they
JJ
have
are getting to.
mismanaged.
They never let him play through it.
But the Heat organization should know better. They should know better. They just kind of threw their hands up and said, "Well, we can't do anything for Duncan because we've got a reasonable facsimile in Max Strus." It's like, well, that's not good enough.
If not for Jimmy Butler and Kyle Lowry and PJ Tucker being on the team last year, they probably do just let him play through it. But because Jimmy and Lowry and PJ at the time were at a certain point in their career, that window shrinks. You don't have as much runway. You're not allowed as much room to play through those mistakes. The window is right now for this roster, for this team. The window is right now. And so I think they made the calculus and said, we can't afford to let Duncan Robinson try to play through this any longer. And they did. They did play him as long as they could last year. I'm not even necessarily concerned with them, what they did last year. I thought they went as far as they basically could with Duncan Robinson last season. It's this season where they really messed up, in my opinion, because they never gave him an opportunity to try to play through things or establish any kind of rhythm shooting wise. But let's move on really quick. Jimmy Butler said it was a blessing and a curse when Spo compared him to Dwyane Wade after last night's dominant fourth quarter. He said that it was a blessing and a curse, and he kind of bristled, saying that he's been compared to D Wade, quote, every step of the way. Let's play that sound really quick.
It's like a blessing and a curse because he is, without a doubt, one of the greats, as you see the news of him being in the Hall of Fame. But then it's like every time you do anything, that's who you get compared to. And I love him to death, but my goodness, it's hard to be compared to him every step of the way. But like I said, it is a blessing as well.
What'd you make of Butler's response?
Shouldn't we save this for the last segment?
Let's do a couple minutes on it now, and then we'll go into the next segment.
Well, I thought he was a little upset at the comparison. As we made a point in yesterday's recap of the win over the Detroit Pistons, he was actively trying to pass the ball. He kind of played off post game, didn't make much of it, but it was obvious that he was trying to get everybody going. And his comments earlier in that same press conference, or as media that were gathered around his locker room, he said, "Yeah, I like to pass the ball. I like to get going." But we know that's not the case, not entirely. Like, Jimmy loves playing this game of cat and mouse with media where he kind of feels like he's feeding us just the kind of information that we need at the moment, et cetera. But it's also, he's got his own ideas behind what he shares, when he shares it, and how he shares that information. At the same time, he was getting everybody going. He was getting Gabe, Max, whoever was out on the floor. He was trying to get them going and get them easy looks, knowing that, as he says himself, when I want to score, I can score whenever I want to. Maybe that point is a little hard, but it's also factual. He can take over games. We've seen this consistently from him. And yes, it was against a bad Pistons team, but it was still a very impressive run nonetheless. And then he has this great moment in the fourth quarter, the final 7 minutes of the game, where he's absolutely dominant, takes over the game, 18 points in the fourth quarter, things that we haven't seen before. You kind of want to bask in the glory of that individual success and not have Eric Spoelstra come up to him and say, "Jimmy, that was just like Dwyane. Incredible moment there." It's like, what about me doing this? What about my accolades? What about my own individual legacy? And I think he was a little upset at the comparison. He's fine in terms of like his respect and admiration for what Dwyane did and has done. But at the same time, I think for players, especially players of the caliber of Jimmy Butler's, you're trying to build an individual legacy, and coming to Miami, maybe there was always going to be a cap on what kind of a legacy he could build, because there were going to be those comparisons to either Dwyane or LeBron or somebody else. But at the same time, I feel like, as he says, making those comparisons omnipresent at a point in time when he just had this incredible run in the fourth quarter, maybe not something he necessarily wanted to hear.
You talk to enough players in the NBA and you ask them similar things or comparisons, to make comparisons maybe even themselves. I mean, you can even listen to these pre-draft interviews with these kids coming out of college or the G League or overseas, and you ask them who they would compare their games to, and every single one of them, they might give you a couple names, but at the end of the sentence, always say, "But I'm one of one." And
Yes.
it's one, and for the most part, it's not true. You could basically compare every player to a past player. I don't think that there's that many different templates of basketball player when it comes to body type and skill set. It's still the same sport at the end of the day, and there's certain skill sets that just exist within the sport. And Jimmy Butler, you can compare in certain ways to Dwyane Wade in terms of being able to get to the line, his ability to take over in the fourth quarter and turn it on, his ability to be efficient in those fourth quarters where he's not just sort of out there chucking shots and scoring points. He's being very efficient in those moments where it felt like Dwyane Wade was too. D Wade's ability to get steals and score and create easy looks that way. Jimmy Butler has that. There are things that are comparable. And from that respect, I understand what Spo was getting to, but at the same time, I'm with you, man. I would be, I guess, maybe a little miffed if I'm Jimmy Butler. And I'm like, Dwyane Wade hasn't been here, man. It's been me. I'm the one that almost took us to the finals last year. I took us to the finals 2 years ago in the bubble, and yet I'm still getting the Dwyane Wade comparisons. But then again, Dwyane Wade's got 3 rings, and you don't. And maybe that should be something to aspire to. I don't know. A fun matchup between the Heat and the 76ers tonight. One key where the Heat have the advantage. It's coming up next. But first, David, tell listeners about our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are almost here. Now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 as a bonus bet back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use, and then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to the number of threes drained per game. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 at bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Reach Locked On Heat on Twitter and on Instagram. You can email us, lockedonheat@gmail.com. The Heat play the 76ers tonight. Quick news. We're recording this 4:30-ish on Wednesday, so we haven't seen the Wednesday night games, obviously. But if Boston beats Toronto tonight, the 76ers are going to be locked into their seed at number 3. They might not have any reason to play anybody on Thursday night. So that's a big deal. TBD on that. But let's just assume that this is a full 76ers squad, Joel Embiid, James Harden, the like. So far this year, the Heat have split the season series with the Sixers 1-1. What I'm looking at in this game, David, this is an important game for the Heat. If they need to try to win out. Bam said it last night after the game. They need to try to win out. Mathematically still in the mix
For the 6th seed.
For the 6th seed. Brooklyn, I think, also plays tonight on the second night of a back-to-back. We'll see what happens with them. So, look, they want to win, obviously. And they also need to make sure they maintain a cushion for that 7th seed in the top spot in the play-in tournament, too. So here's what I'm looking at. Number 1, keep Joel Embiid out of the paint. You got to do that. Easier said than done. Probably not going to do it. All right. So understanding that you're not going to do it ultimately, then we end up back at Jimmy Butler. Playoff Jimmy needs to score with Joel Embiid, and as cute as and as interesting as it was for him to take one shot in the first half last night, that ain't going to fly against the 76ers if Joel Embiid is a full go, right? Like, you need Jimmy, playoff Jimmy, last 7 minutes of the fourth quarter last night, Jimmy Butler. You need that from the opening tip to the end of the game. That's the only chance that the Heat have in this one. I have got one other key for this game for the Heat, but let's just talk about that one first. Playoff Jimmy needing to score with Joel Embiid. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that bottom line, we saw it against Detroit. Like, despite the fact that they've quote unquote leaned offensively with their rotation change, they're not necessarily generating points to the same degree. I don't know that it has to necessarily be point for point, but we've seen Jimmy take on that challenge personally, and he does want to match Joel's production level. So I'm curious to see how it plays out. Like, we're not going to see the same passive version of Jimmy that we saw in the first 3 quarters against Detroit. That's for sure. He's going to be active, looking to establish dominance. He does want to prove a point against the Philadelphia 76ers. That's going to happen. Even the fact that it's in Philadelphia, I think, gives him more motivation than anything else. So maybe we just got a taste of what we could possibly get from him, in the fourth quarter against Detroit. And I'm curious to see how it plays out against the Sixers.
I hypothesized this with you yesterday. Like, was Jimmy just sort of foot off the gas against, a tanking Pistons team for 3 quarters, kind of anticipating maybe needing to go full out, pedal to the metal Thursday night against the Sixers, and then understanding there's a second night of a back-to-back Friday night too? Like, was he looking forward on the schedule and saying, you know what, if I'm going to take a night off, maybe this is the one?
Okay. Yeah. Very likely. And look, also to that same point, Jimmy in that same press conference that we played a clip from before also said he doesn't watch the standings. How many times can we possibly call BS on this? Like, come on, dude.
Yeah,
Like everybody in that locker room.
coaches and players will tell you two things, and they're lying through their teeth. I don't look at the standings, and I don't read anything. That is not true. That is not true. Players and
Right.
coaches always look at the standings because, first of all, it's their industry, it's their job. I think they're genuinely interested. They watch more basketball than they even let on. So that there's that. Number
Yeah.
two, they do read, they do hear, they are on social media, they do see everything.
They all go to their
your
hotel
favorite
room.
players, if your favorite player just went dark on Twitter, guess what? Your player also your favorite player also probably has another burner account that he's using to scroll through Twitter. Also, I'm telling you that stuff is almost 99.9% of the time a flat out lie.
Yeah, they all talk about going back to their hotel room, especially on a road trip. You're going to spend a night in Detroit. I know you can get into whatever activity you want to when you're there. If you fly in early to Philadelphia, again, it's cold up there. I'm not sure how much you're going to actually be able to go out and get done. It's not like traveling to LA or Chicago or Miami or New York even. So it's like, you're going to be in your hotel room. What are you calling to do? You're an NBA fan or an NBA player. You're going to watch basketball. And at some point in time while you're watching basketball, guess what? They're probably going to show you the standings. Current Eastern Conference playoff race, and they're going to show you right there, Miami, 2 games down on Brooklyn Nets.
You don't think Jimmy Butler knows that the Milwaukee Bucks are the #1 seed? Of course he does. Of course he does.
Like,
you don't think
the
that
Bucks are a good team? I just don't know where.
You don't think he's aware that he's going to have to play an extra game or two next week? Of course he is. Final thing that the Heat need to do in this game, and this is where they could really flip the game and get a win here. Again, if the 76ers are a full go, if they're not resting their players based on what happens tonight. Create turnovers, get out in transition. I was watching the Celtics play the 76ers Tuesday night. I was rewatching the game because obviously the Heat played Tuesday night. So I was rewatching the game Wednesday morning. And the thing that just sticks out to me is Boston can be so good when they are creating those deflections, creating those turnovers, getting out into the open floor, and then finding those 3-pointers, or if it's maybe Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum getting to the basket. No Jaylen Brown last night, but you get my point overall. The Heat are the same way, right? But the Heat really need to get in transition, not only to create offense, but also to create stops defensively, right? And so everything with this Miami Heat team, like, they are at their best. Everything is elevated when they're A, creating turnovers, and then B, using those turnovers to score at the other end, because now you're getting stops and now you're creating easy offense where otherwise you don't have that. So, and against the 76ers team, they're especially susceptible to that because Joel Embiid does not want to get out and run. He wants to get to the basket. He wants to hit you with some sort of turnaround, kind of weird fadeaway thing that he does. And if you're able to knock the ball away, he's not going to sprint down the other end. James Harden doesn't really want to do that either. They don't have a lot of guys that want to do that. They're kind of a slow, big plotting team. And so if you could do that, that's the big way to kind of create an advantage. And I think the Heat, based on the fact that Jimmy Butler had 4 steals last night, if he can kind of engage that version of his defense, and if you're getting that from Caleb Martin, Gabe Vincent, and other guys, yeah, that's a way for the Heat to get a win tonight.
We've seen it before in the win against Philadelphia earlier this season. I think when Philadelphia had their full complement of players, like Jimmy was active, especially on the defensive end, forcing those turnovers, creating easy opportunities for himself. We've seen it all year. This was the base of their offense for much of the season until they kind of leaned into it. Yeah, exactly. Well, certainly their defense, but even their offense, it was transition points, force off turnovers. So I'm curious to see if they can replicate that kind of success. Look, Embiid had 50-something points of their total of 103. Maybe they only won by 2. Could this be a scenario where Miami just kind of lets Embiid do what Embiid things and try and shut everybody else down? Because my biggest concern isn't necessarily Joel Embiid. It's Tyrese Maxey, of all people. Yeah. He just seems to have that extra gear that you were talking about. For a slower team or slower-paced team, when you look at Harden and Embiid, more of a half-court type offense, Maxey is not that guy, and he's always seems like he's got an extra level against Miami for whatever reason. His shooting has always been pretty good against Miami, and his ability to get to the rim, even against a top-tier defender in Jimmy Butler or somebody else, it's I don't know. It bodes poorly for Miami's chances tomorrow if he gets it going early on.
Well said. Yeah. Maybe it is a situation where you just said, okay, Embiid, you're going to get your 43 points tonight. It's just going to happen. Nothing we can really do about it. But let's shut down Tobias Harris. Let's shut down James Harden. Do your best to shut down Tyrese Maxey, who does always seem to go off against the Miami Heat. He's really good, though, by the way. He's starting to develop a little bit of pick-and-roll chemistry with Joel Embiid, too. So it's just something to keep an eye on. But Yeah, we'll see if the 76ers even play those guys. We don't know. Fun times. 3 more games left in the season. We'll be back here after the game with a recap of the game. For now, thanks again for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Remember to subscribe to new episodes of Locked On Heat on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Now make your second listen game to game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA. It's available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. David, thanks for joining me.
I personally hate the comparisons to Lee Jenkins all the time, but that's just me.
You mean as a Clippers staff front office guy?
No.